This is a reading from the Diary of Jesus by Jean Aulagnier. Meanwhile, Longinus walked over to John and whispered something to him. After this, he asked for a spear, and, John chapter 19, verse 34b, opened Jesus' side with it. Immediately, blood and water came out. As Joseph and Nicodemus were hurrying down to see Pilate, they ran across Gamaliel. He wore no veil nor coat and was running away from the temple. He had witnessed the veil being torn asunder. He was running to the cross, shouting, "The sign! I saw the sign! Tell me you forgive me!" A Roman stopped him with his spear and said, "Quiet, he is dead. And I, a pagan, I tell you that the one you have crucified." Matthew 27, verse 54d, there is no doubt about it. He was the Son of God. This was the Roman commander of 10 whose soldier Jesus had healed near Beth Horon. Footnote 26. See October 18th, AD 29, page 220, editor. As for the two thieves, they were terrorized and remained speechless. John chapter 19, verse 31. Now the Jews would not let the bodies remain crucified on the Sabbath, because that Sabbath day was a solemn one. Since it was now the eve, they asked Pilate that the bodies might have their legs broken and be taken away. Longinus gave orders to the 4 executioners. Meanwhile, John, Joseph, and Nicodemus took Jesus' body down from the cross. John chapter 19, verse 41. Now, in the same corridor where he was crucified, there was a garden with a new tomb in it, one in which no one had ever yet been buried. It belonged to Joseph. He immediately offered it to Mary, who was becoming worried. Nicodemus had already brought, John chapter 19, verse 39c, about 100 pounds of a mixture of myrrh and aloes to the tomb. Jesus' body was covered with refuse and blood clots. Nicodemus and Joseph hastily wiped it with the sheet in which they had carried him. After this, they quickly embalmed him, though incompletely. Then they wrapped him up in the clean shroud. Luke chapter 23, verse 54. It was the day of preparation. The Sabbath drew on, and the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph, Nicodemus, John and Mary. They saw the tomb and how Jesus' body was buried. At this, the women left. The Blessed Virgin could not bring herself to leave, and the men had to remove her. Joseph, Mark chapter 15, verse 46e, rolled a heavy stone against the door of the tomb. It took a while before they could convince Mary to come out of Joseph's orchard. At last, they returned to the Eucharistic house. Meanwhile, the high priests and the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 27, verse 66b, made the tomb secure, putting a seal on the stone and setting a guard over it. Shortly before sunset, the Passover Sabbath was about to begin. John entered the house with the women. At this point, it is helpful to backtrack a bit. One might wonder why Jesus celebrated the Passover meal 24 hours before the official time, that is, Thursday night instead of Friday night. After all, Jesus came to fulfill the law, and he celebrated the ancient ritual meal correctly in all other regards. The point is that the Last Supper must not be considered only as a Passover meal. It must be considered primarily as the time at which Jesus instituted the new rite of the Eucharist. The Last Supper also prepared for Jesus' redemptive sacrifice on the cross. Now the Father's designs called for the slaying of the Lamb of God on Friday, the day before the Passover. For this reason, it was impossible for Jesus to celebrate his Last Supper on Friday night, the actual night of the Passover. One might wonder why the chief priests did not blame Jesus for celebrating the Passover meal 24 hours ahead of time. After all, they were constantly on the lookout for his violations of the law, and this would appear to be an outrageous liturgical impropriety. The solution is rooted in the empirical way in which the beginning of the month was determined at the time. Once the Sanhedrin had made its decision, practically at the last minute, messengers would be dispatched to all points of Palestine to indicate the exact day when the new month began. Since this process sometimes entailed errors, a new custom gradually emerged. Jews living in remote areas, like the Galileans, were allowed to celebrate the meal one day early. This is why Jesus' decision surprised neither the Judeans nor the apostles. The women who kept Mary company that evening had a hard time preventing her from entering the Eucharist room. They felt that this would have caused her too much grief. They took her to her room. She was going to refuse food altogether and deny herself sleep. This way, she would consecrate all her energy to ward off Satan, who would tempt her, in vain, to believe that everything was all over. The Blessed Virgin prayed and prayed. Late in the evening, Veronica knocked at the door. She had come with her maid and a bodyguard. Very moved, she told Mary about her adventure. After Jesus had put her handkerchief on his face, he handed it back to her. She kept it as a relic and left with her maid, both being protected by the Roman women. She fainted during the earthquake, and when she regained consciousness, she was utterly astonished to see the picture of Jesus' face on the precious handkerchief. She desired to give it to the Redeemer's mother immediately, and that is why she had arrived so late at night. April 6th, Saturday. As the night went by, the women began to wonder whether they could find some balm and ointments. This is because they thought that they would need some to properly embalm Jesus' body on the first day of the week. They decided that there had to be some at Lazarus's or Cusa's palace. Valeria came shortly after, bringing some precious resins from Claudia and Plautina. By then it was nearly dawn. At daybreak, as soon as the gates were opened, John parted from the holy women. He went to look for the other apostles. Manaen came in immediately after John left. Manaen had just spent the night at Nicodemus's home. The fact that Manaen was a follower of Christ apparently put him in danger at Herod's court. Manaen decided to go to Bethany right away to find out what was happening at Lazarus' house. He wanted to please Mary. She reminded him that it was the Sabbath, but he said that the law of love mattered more than the Sabbath. Mary did not object. Mary then had the other women let her into the Eucharist room. When she returned to her room, she was exhausted. After this, Isaac the shepherd arrived from Bethany, bringing some news of all those who had taken refuge there. Jesus' Aunt Mary began to worry about her sons Joseph and Simon, since they were not at Lazarus's. Later on, Longinus, the centurion, came over, unwittingly frightening some of the women. He brought over the spear with which Jesus' side had been opened. Mary had requested this through Joseph. John came back by himself at noon. He had found Judas's body. He immediately left for Gethsemane to fetch the coat that Jesus had left behind. The women had a quick lunch, nibbling on bread and olives. John had left without eating. As for Holy Mary, all that she had was a little water. She was entirely consumed by thoughts of her son. Johanna and Jonathan came over, and then Joseph and Nicodemus brought some bags of myrrh and aloes. They all wept at the sight of Jesus' face on the linen. Some Galileans dropped by afterwards. Zebedee, Jesus' cousins, Simon and Joseph, and Susanna's husband. Some had run into John, others Isaac. Joseph said that he was grieved that he had taken so long to recognize his cousin as the Messiah. At sundown, Mary retired into her room and prayed again. She asked the Lord for everyone to receive the strength needed to believe. Later in the night, Holy Mary was found kneeling in the dark by her sister-in-law. Her window was open and it was cold, but she was still praying. John arrived shortly afterwards. He had been gone for a long time. First, he retraced the way along which Jesus had been taken after his arrest. John went to the place where Peter was curled up next to a rock. Peter was totally devastated by the fact that he had disowned Jesus the day before. Peter did not want to come with John until he knew everything that had happened. Peter then brought Jesus' coat, which he had been piously hanging onto. Peter remained right at the door. He was crying, waiting to be called in. Mary once more had to ignore her own grief. She welcomed Peter and assured him that Jesus would forgive him. Mary spent the rest of the night praying and fasting. She was determined to pray until her son returned. The Glorification, footnote 27. The Glorification is the title given to the seventh and last part of the poem of the Man God by Maria Valtorta. April 7th, Sunday of AD 30. Meanwhile, since the Sabbath was over, the other women were busy preparing the balms. It was not even 5 in the morning when they left. They carried jars of balm in large bags and headed for Jesus' tomb. The Blessed Virgin and the men remained behind. Mary prayed intensely, asking the Father to return their son as soon as possible. The guards were keeping watch in the garden. The stone had been set in place by a thick layer of cement. The women walked discreetly. They talked for a while and decided to divide into 3 groups. First of all, Martha and Mary of Clopas would get Johanna. Susanna and Mary Salome would go to the city walls and wait. Mary of Bethany would go by herself and survey the area. Specifically, she would determine the guards' frame of mind. It was under these circumstances that a magnificent meteor appeared in the east at 5 in the morning. It shed an incredible light as it streaked by, creating a melodious and mighty sound. Like lightning, it struck the sealed grave entrance and toppled this pitiful obstacle. There had been an earthquake when the Lord yielded his spirit 38 hours earlier. In like manner, there was an earth tremor when the Spirit of the Lord came back to his body. The Lord was ahead of his appointments with history for the second time. For the second time, this was due to Mary's earnest prayers. The first time had been the Son's incarnation, which occurred a few years before the time set by Daniel's prophecies. The second time was the Son's resurrection, which happened before the 3 fateful days were actually completed. The Lord did this so that Mary's suffering might be shortened, as she victoriously overcame Satan's terrible temptations. God's Spirit entered the tomb like a flaming sword. It transcended the cold corpse covered with blood clots. The Son walked out in his risen body, wearing heavenly clothing, mystically woven by the Father, like that of the virginal lilies. The risen Christ immediately appeared to Mary. Excuse me. He entered her room along with the first ray of sunshine. It would now be marvel after marvel. Jesus would appear to many people. He began with those who had most faithfully followed him all along his Calvary. After his mother, it was Mary of Magdala's turn. She had felt the earth tremor on the way to the grave. She nearly fell and hurried on. John chapter 20, verse 1d. She found the stone moved away from the tomb door. So she came running to Simon Peter and that other disciple whom Jesus loved, John. They have carried away the Lord from the tomb, she said to them, and we do not know where they have taken him. Upon this, Peter and the other disciple both set out and made their way to the tomb. Meanwhile, Susanna and Salome ran over to the tomb. They saw a great light streaming out of the opening. They drew near and saw a creature.